So if you're back here, you're ready to see the next little clip on completing this project on Mr. Freeze. And we've got a few details to talk about, and once again, we're going to break it down into a smaller segment so that you can absorb all the info that's in here. There's just so much. But first of all, let's do a quick recap of where we left off last segment so that you can have an idea where we're working on this segment. So, in the last one, you saw that we started with a blank copy of Warhammer, and all those Warhammer guys were thinking it's going to be a repaint of their favorite figure. Well, it's not, it's Mr. Freeze. So, here we are, we left off in one of these segments, and we ripped off the eagle, and then we ripped off his head, and then we ripped off those little pauldrons that are on those shoulders, and then we went ahead and ripped off those pegs and saved them. And I bet those Warhammer guys are so unhappy that we ripped off that eagle, and then we gave him a different head sculpt. So, here we are now. We are now on the belt. And there's two things that I did wrong on this. Actually, one of them is wrong, one of them is right. I cut it wrong. So, be careful with that X-Acto knife. As you bend that armor plate to the side, cut along the thickest area, not the thinnest. So, I did it correctly on one side, and there's plenty of belt material to work on. Once you've already removed them, make sure you sand away those rough edges and all those glue spots. This is the one that I ended up cutting too far into the plastic. But it's repairable. Epoxy sculpt will fill it in and it will take care of that situation. And this is the correct side that I cut. Oh, actually, I cut this side correctly. I cut along the thicker area of the armor to leave plenty of the belt material to work with. Once again, it is rough, so I have to clean it up, get away those rough edges, and of course those glue spots. And if you saw on the inside of the belt, this thing was glued to a T. I was not able to remove it as easily as some of the other pieces. So just be careful. It is a soft plastic, and it becomes even softer once you heat it up. Now, clean up all of those glue spots because you want it to glue down correctly onto the trunks once you're ready to do so. So you can use this sanding drum, or you can use a different bit that you have on your Dremel. The important thing is to make it nice and clean. So it'll take you a little bit of time to get it all set up the way you need it. And just stay on the inside. Don't damage any of the other components of the belt itself. So before we reattach it to the trunks, we're going to do as much sanding as possible, as it is easier to hold it this way and we don't damage the paint that we already have on the trunks. So I'm using a sanding block, a 200 grit sandpaper, then I'm moving over to a 400 and then a 800. You can go to the 1200 and the 14 if you want to. However, I would leave those for last after applying the epoxy or the paste that you want to use, because that'll give it a nice, clean, glossy finish. It'll make it look like it's a harder plastic than it already is. So it's time to use the glue, E600. It's actually an upholstery glue or a fabric glue. Again, it's a gel that you apply with an applicator. I'm using a small file at this point, but you can use a toothpick, you can use a popsicle stick, whatever applicator that it is you want to use to get in those fine areas that are hard to get into with your finger. Of course, you don't want any glue on your finger because then you'll get it over your product. Apply as much glue as you need. In this case, I'm applying it everywhere that I saw that it was already previously attached to. You don't want it to ooze on the outside though. You have any oozing to be done, it should be on the inside of the trunk so it stays hidden. And as you press down, apply a little pressure, you can see that glue seeping through, and that's fine on the inside as mentioned. But as you can already tell, it's looking pretty good. Now we just have some gaps to fill with that epoxy sculpt. Epoxy is a 2-part clay or putty, and you mix them down to a 1-piece unit or 1 putty, and then you can apply it and attach. Now, I don't have the correct clamps. It's obvious. I tried using these, it just didn't work out. Just not enough material there to grab with these flat surface clamps. So in any case, I went a different route, and I went ahead and used some blue tape. And the blue tape did the job. I cut it in strips, and then I just wrapped it around the belt itself, and that did the trick. So here's our blue tape already cut in strips, and I just wrapped it around nice and tight, and I left it there for a couple hours. Once that glue dried, it was time to mix up that A and B epoxy and get it ready to apply to the belt. Of course, I did remove the tape, so the next segment you will see that I don't have any tape on those trucks. And here we go, we are all set. Now, I did let the epoxy set for about 20 minutes before I started applying it. The reason you want to do that, it is because once you mix it, it's kind of sticky and it's really soft. You want it to have a thicker, sturdier consistency so that when you apply it, it will actually stick and not come off. You could do it with your hands, but then you're going to leave texture from your fingerprints. So it's best to use an applicator. In this case, I'm using a shaping tool with a rubber tip, and then I'm of course cutting away the excess that I don't need with the X-Acto knife. So just by tapping it with the flat surface of this rubber piece, I'm getting what I need, and if there's any texture left from that anyway, I'll just sand it down later. So I'm applying just what I need on both sides. This has a bigger gap, so we definitely need a lot more putty. Put it in with your hands and then just push it down so it sticks. Again, if you're using your fingers, just remember that you can end up pulling it off because it'll stick to your fingers. And then you've got oil from your hands, so it's best to use an applicator. Like I said, it's going to take time. It's not in a 10-minute process, because after you do this sculpting work, then you got to have it dry. And now you can use a hair dryer. Honestly, don't want to sit there and use a hair dryer for 20-30 minutes, because it's going to take longer than 20-30 minutes for this to truly cure and be hardened. So I did the next best thing. I put it outside in the sun. It's nice and warm outside, so I left it there for the entire day. And once I came back, it was hard like ceramic, so it was easier to work on. Once that's done, you can actually do the rest of the shaping, the sanding, the cutting, the molding with any other shaping tool. In this case, this is almost there, so we just got to put it outside to dry in the sun. And here it is, back from the outside oven. It is nice and dry, and we're gonna sand off the rest of those edges and polish it out. And like I said, I'll use a 1200 grit to finish it off and leave it nice and smooth. And here we go. I've already painted it. This is what it looks like. You don't need to see all the sanding process. What I do want to tell you about is that button, that red button. You saw that it was flat. Now I did paint it in a red, and then I came back after it dried and I put in a drop of liquid resin, and then I hardened it with the ultraviolet light, and that's what it looks like. I really like the way it turned out. So it's time to make our way back to the torso. And I always leave the head on the body just because that gives me that idea of what it looks like as I'm working on it. So again, I mixed up another batch of A and B epoxy sculpt. And as you can see, I'm using the same applicator as before, or the shaping tool, because I don't want it all over my fingers. And I'm just tapping it in, just filling in the gap where that eagle was. It really wasn't attractive the way it looks, so I had to come up with something different. And as I filled it in, I just got different ideas as what to do. I ended up shaping it into what would be a padding, an insulation. Well, not exactly sure what to call it. But in any case, I filled in the gap. And then I had to give it some sort of texture because I didn't want it just to look like metal. I didn't want the Iron Man look. I wanted it to be different from the other characters. So let me show you how I got to that process. In the meantime, let me speed up the rest of this video so you can see this gap being filled. So once I filled up the gap, then I had to smooth it out to do some of the detail work that I thought about adding to this. So I took the end of the applicator or the shaping tool and I just kind of rolled it out to smooth it out as best as possible over the edges. And it did okay. I ended up switching to the other end of this shaping tool, which is also a rubber tip, and I just pulled the sculpting from the center out, and then just did the best I could as far as smoothing it out. So as you can see here, it's already starting to have a thicker consistency, so that actually helps to your advantage because now whatever shape you create onto it will actually hold. If it's too soft, it ends up sticking to your tools and it ends up pulling away, and it just becomes really difficult. So if you leave it set for about 20 to 30 minutes, it will gain that consistency and it will be actually easier to work on. So I'm just filling in the little tiny gaps that are not as easy to fill by freehand. So I'm using it now with the tool, and I'm just doing the best that I can to make it as clean as possible. So again, this is a work in progress. It's an idea that happened as I was working on it, and I automatically thought, well, what texture am I going to use? What am I going to apply as a texture? I had all kinds of ideas. However, the final idea that it came down to was a fabric texture. And if you're looking at the end of that knife, you see a texture on that, I guess it's the collar. I guess that's what you would call it. So I had another one that has that same texture, and actually it's the piece of my dremel because it comes with different attachments. So I used the end of the dremel, the collar from one of the pieces of the dremel, and that's what I used to give it the texture, and you'll see in just a moment. But aside from the texture, I also wanted to have some line work, and the fact that the putty was starting to get a thicker consistency made it that much easier to work with for the line work. Let me show you. Oh, before I do that, let me show you my new tool. It's that armor plate that I removed off the belt. It is now my new shaping tool. So I'm putting it to use. And by the way, this was definitely a lot bigger project than I thought, especially adding the texture and molding to the chest. It's a small area, but it still took me over an hour to get everything done the way I wanted it to show. So it's not as quick as you may think. I think the whole project all in all has taken me over a week at this point. So it's time to add those straight lines of artwork. And as you can see, the putty has now a good consistency, or epoxy. And I just used the back of the X-Acto blade. So it gave me the depth that I needed, it gave me the width that I needed, and I just had to be creative with the lines. And the simpler, the better. I just took ideas again from other references, and no, Mr. Freeze maybe doesn't have this, but this one does. And at the same time, I'm going back in with my shaping tool and pushing down any of the odd areas that are not truly flattened. However, in the end, that really did make a difference because I ended up using a texture over the line work. So going on the opposite direction or the opposite side and just giving a different diagonal just to give it a different aesthetic look. So that's it, just a couple passes and boom. And because it has that consistency, it's holding the shape. Now you just have to go back and refine some of those lines so that it looks like it was molded that way. Again, at this point, I really was happy with the diagonal lines, but I wasn't happy with the texture. I didn't want to go back and have to sand all of this just to make it smooth, and then it's just going to look like an Iron Man figure. That's something I wanted to stay away from. So let me show you what I did. Again, I took that extra piece or the collar that goes to my Dremel, the one that holds the bits in, and then I just rolled the edge over the epoxy sculpt while it was still malleable. And I just did the best I could to get to as close as the edges as possible. That's it. Then I just let it dry. And because obviously I couldn't put this into the oven to dry, I had to use nature's own oven. I put it outside on the bench in the backyard. I left it there for the full day while I went to work. Came back and boom, it's dry, it's ready. There's no sanding to do. There's no polishing to do. All I really got to do at this point, once it's dry, is just kind of clean up the edges, just so it looks like a nice sharp line all the way to the edge. Let me show you what the end product looks so far. So I continued using the X-Acto knife as best I could to clean up the edges, and then I finally resorted to the flathead screwdriver, and I just cleaned up the edge even more. That way, again, I don't have to do this after it's dry. Once it's dry, it's virtually impossible to do it. So it's best to do it while the epoxy sculpt is still malleable. That way it's an easy cleanup. Any little imperfections can be corrected before you set it out to dry in the sun. Once you set it out there, it's going to harden very quickly and it's going to be permanent. So anything that you want to stay or change, this is the time to do it. So it's time to take a decision. And one of those was adding some wear and tear marks before it's too late. Once you do it now, it's going to be that much easier. So I added some little creases as if they were folds in the fabric, and that way it looks a little bit more believable, as it would be a different texture, like an insulation or some kind of Kevlar, whatever. Use your imagination. The whole point is that you got to do the work before it hardens out in the sun. Clean it up as best as possible. And that's what it looks like so far. It still hasn't got out into the sun yet. I got to work on those shoulders. Again, I don't want to use these shoulder pauldrons because I don't want it to look like Warhammer. I want it to look like Mr. Freeze. But I don't need those empty holes. So another idea came up, and I'll go ahead and share it with you. Yeah, it can fill in the holes and it's going to look very simple, but I decided to add a little bit thicker of a padding on the side. I use my new shaping tool here, and what I ended up doing is I ended up making it a nice thick padding, but I added texture and I stippled it with the wire bristle brush that comes with the Dremel, so that it looks like a rustic metal that's had some wear and tear, and it's got some mold on it. But anyway, I'm ended up covering it with a, what's it called? Actually, it's actually made by Vallejo. It's a frost paint, but I just don't want it to be frosted on the metal. I wanted it to look like it's a corrosive metal or corroding metal covered in frost. So the end clip here, you'll see the finished look or dried portion of the shoulder without those pauldrons. So again, this is just part of the creative process. In the case that you don't like the way it looks, you just sand it down and start over. In this case, I decided to go through with it and see where it would take me. So I kept applying the same to the opposite side, and not in the same quantities because I wanted it to look different. They should look different. They're not gonna be naturally the same on both sides if they're corroding. Anyway, this is the end result. So I stippled it down with that wire brush, and then I just slightly sanded it over, and that's kind of what it's gonna look like once it's painted and frosted over with that Vallejo frost paint. It's not in yet. I've ordered it. We'll see what it looks like when it comes in. In the meantime, this is it for today. I'm going to leave you with a little clip, little teaser for the next segment. If you liked the video, please comment, share, and of course subscribe. And above all, don't forget to keep customizing.